Hi friends, this is Angelica. Thanks for joining me here on the Greetery YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be introducing you to a few products from the new Wild Elegance collection, and then we're going to make some stenciled backgrounds and cards. Let's take a quick look at the products that we're going to be using. This is the new Lovely Silhouette stamp set. This set has 4 floral silhouette stamps and an assortment of sentiments that can be paired together or stamped separately. There's also a coordinating die set with dies that will die cut the silhouettes. We're also going to be using the new Color Spot stencils. There's 2 stencils in this set with lots of different shapes to make abstract backgrounds with. We're going to start off with the stencils. Now, I've never used a stencil set like this before, so I decided to make my first background really simple. I picked the longer rectangle shape to work with. Once I had the stencil taped in place, I used a sheet of printer paper to mask off the other shapes. And for the colors, I'm going to be using Pink Fresh Studio inks. I started with Coral Reef and blended an even layer over the stencil. Once I pulled the stencil off, I moved the stencil down just a little bit and taped it back down and moved on to Passion Fruit ink. I'm going to continue doing this for the rest of the panel, working from red inks to yellow. I'm going to speed through the stenciling process here and just show the colors that I used. So after Passion Fruit, I moved on to Berrylicious to finish the reds. And then for the orange colors, I picked Clementine and Peach Fuzz. And for the yellows, I used Sweet Mustard and Lemon Whip. Once I finished, I cleaned off the stencil and moved on to the next background. I played around with a couple different shapes and positions before deciding on using the small squares on this stencil. I love making clean and simple cards and thought a rainbow strip of squares would be fun. So I got the stencil in place, taped it down, and masked off the rest of the shapes, and then I started building my rainbow. I started with ink blending Passion Fruit ink, pulled off the stencil, then switched to the other square and moved on to Apricot ink. I continued doing this, making sure that I was turning the stencil so I was using different sides of the squares. So each square looked unique to the other squares. And I did clean the stencil after each use so I didn't contaminate my ink pads. And I periodically rotated the printer paper so the mask didn't get too wet with ink. I picked lighter ink colors to keep the rainbow really soft and transparent. The rest of the colors that I used were Lemon Whip for yellow, Fresh Pear for the green, Ocean Breeze, which is a beautiful soft turquoise color, Sky Blue, Soft Lilac, and Sparkling Rose. I didn't make it all the way to the other side of the panel like I had visualized in my head, but that is totally fine. I'm just going to trim off the panel when it comes time to put it on a card base. Moving on to the next background, I again picked 2 shapes, this time the larger squares on the second stencil. Since these shapes are pretty big, I just picked 3 blue inks to use over the stencil, starting with Summer Splash. I really tried my best to not overthink on the positions and what shapes I'm going to use. I didn't want to get lost in thought. So if I like the position, I pretty much made myself commit to it and not overthink things. So the other 2 blue inks that I used were Seaside and Storm. And while I was working with this larger square, I thought it would be fun to stencil a few colors over the one shape. So that's what I'm going to do for the next background. I picked Lemon Whip, Ocean Breeze, and Sparkling Rose inks to work with. I made sure to overlap the colors and I blended pretty quickly so the ink was pretty wet on the paper and was able to blend together and make secondary colors. So this really pretty rainbow came together nice and easy. I have one more background to share, and this time we're going to make our own rectangle stencil. I used a small rectangle from Crimp's Frames and my 0 center ruler for proper placement on the printer paper that I'm going to use as my stencil. I die cut the paper and then I taped it to a panel. And then I picked 3 colors to make an evening sky. I started with Summer Splash, then Lavender and Sparkling Rose. The blue and the lavender turned out to be a bit too light, so I went over them with sapphire for the blue and candy violet for over the lavender. And these colors turned out to be perfect. So this was exactly what I was picturing when I started the background. And here's a quick look at the backgrounds. Now it's time to stamp them and turn them into cards. I'm going to start with the rainbow squared background. I've already trimmed the panel down, and I picked the word congratulations from Lovely Silhouette stamp set to stamp right in the middle of the squares. So I positioned the stamp, and then I'm going to stamp it on the grid sheet first, just to make sure that I have that stamp lined up properly before I stamp it on the card panel. And I'm using VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink to stamp the sentiment. This is going to be the ink that I'm going to use for all of the panels. I'm using the large silhouette stamp for the next two panels. I made sure to position the stamp right in the middle of the card front and then added the ink and stamped. This ink is a pigment ink, so the stamped results are really crisp and vibrant. The ink just sits right on top of the paper perfectly. The ink does need a little bit of time to dry, so I set the panels aside for a few minutes so I didn't smudge the images. The last image from the stamp set that I'm going to use is the smaller floral silhouette. I trimmed the single rainbow background pretty small, and then I stamped the small flower. I didn't use the panel for this video, but it's going to be perfect for a small note card. And for the last panel, I used the Scripty Hello die to die cut two hellos. I glued them together and then glued them to the panel. For the large silhouette cards, I picked two sentiments to white heat emboss onto black cardstock. I positioned them in my MISTI, and then I prepped the paper with anti-static powder. I stamped the sentiments with Versamark embossing ink, and then I poured Brutus Monroe alabaster embossing powder over the ink. I tapped off the excess powder and then melted it with my heat tool and trimmed the sentiments with a crimped slimline die. For the last panel, I picked Dear Friend from Opposites Attract stamp set to match the hello. I used my MISTI again to stamp the sentiment so I can make sure that the stamp was straight. To finish the cards, I attached the panels to card bases. The hello and congratulation panels were backed with black cardstock first, and the large silhouette panels went directly onto the card bases. I did use my T-ruler to help me align the sentiment strips so they went on the card straight, and that's going to finish the cards. You can find more details on these products and on the rest of the release over on the Greetery blog. I want to thank you so much again for hanging out with me, and I want to thank the Greetery for letting me introduce these products to you. That's all that I have for today. Take care.